So you began to touch on something here that I think would be useful. Again, maybe let's see if we could tease this out a little bit, and maybe move from sort of high level to more practical here, as you've begun to discuss, Leo. You talked about reallocation of focus and bandwidth and attention for leaders, and maybe some implications on planning. And we've talked about risk intelligence. If you were going to name some other very specific investments or areas to focus on related to risk intelligence, let's say, imagine a leader or an organization who hadn't historically been planning and thinking in this way. What would the first array of suggestions, recommendations, areas to focus on for a leader in an organization like that, what would they be around risk intelligence?
Devote a concerted effort to understanding the major risks and uncertainties relevant to the organization. Right? That's the first step in a lot of that. Secondly, enhance your planning process. And I'll let Chuck talk about that, because as we all know, the vast majority of organizations have planning designed as sort of one base case scenario that is based on a variety of assumptions. It's typically, even if it's surrounded by contingency planning, it's very, very narrow in imagining what kinds of things that can happen. So revamping risk, revamping planning are two things, but there's one more thing that I think is really hitting home as a result of the past year or so. And that is, yes, we can develop capabilities. And it's super important that we have risk radars and planning processes, et cetera. Yes, we can equip our organization with the requisite knowledge of what it means to study the environment, what's the difference between risk and uncertainty, et cetera. But unless you war game it, unless you practice, the two may not be sufficient, because it's in the practice part that you reveal hidden vulnerabilities, hidden connections between risks, all sorts of cultural and leadership deficiencies. So I would say these three things: knowledge, capabilities, and practice are the things that many of our clients are really starting to attack now.
Chuck, did you want to build on that? Leo invited you there midstream.
Chuck, you're muted.
Oh, you're muted.
I'm going to pedal backwards a little bit here and just start off with the business of senior leader time. I've spent some time working with new general officers and flag officers in the United States military. And the first thing that I pass on to them that I had to discover is that the first order of business for a senior leader is to make sure that the purpose and the top line messaging, the vision and purpose of the organization, that they own it, that they wrap their arms around it. If they're satisfied with it, they own it. If they're not satisfied with it, they think about how it needs to be adjusted and what's the best method to do it. And usually the best method is to share or co-create with their senior leadership team. And then the next thing is the senior leaders' first order of business is doing the things that only they can do for the organization. And so, their engagement with the environment at their level, the stakeholders, whether it's a parent or a competitor or people in the marketplace, they have to do the things first that only they can do. Otherwise, it doesn't get done. And so in the end, taking those kinds of steps inevitably leads to, developing, cultural norms that they have to own. And if they don't realize that they eventually own the culture of the organization, somebody else is going to own it. It's going to get created somewhere in the organization, and multiple cultures can exist. within the organizations, and we've all seen that happen. So this business of senior leader time and where senior leaders spend it is really critical. And the idea that they don't have time to think strategically and plan strategically and act strategically is very bad, because they can't do that in the mailroom. So if they're not doing it, it's not getting done in the organization, and they're just going from quarterly meeting to quarterly meeting. I'll also tell you this idea of strategy. Strategy is not a sentence. It's not a glossy trifold on the coffee table in the CEO's office, and it's not a whole list of hows. This is how we're going to do. We're going to do this. We're going to be like this. We're going to be like that. We're going to be like that. It's more what. Who are we? What are we? What are we going to do? Who are we going to become? What are the aspirational? A strategy is the aspirational goals of the organization, and it's the how you're going to accomplish that over time is really secondary, because part of planning is, what if this uncertainty comes to pass? Then what are we going to do? What if something else happens? What are we going to do in order to continue to meet the purpose and the vision of the organization? Senior leaders own all of that. And we've seen folks become interested in those key points. So I'll stop there.
Thank you.
Yeah,
I love that line of sight.
If I could just amplify something that Chuck just said. We've spent a lot of time trying to think what distinguishes agility from other kinds of qualities, from anti-fragility or adaptability or flexibility, all of these terms, right? And it's essentially these three things that come at the end of agility that Chuck just alluded to. One is purposefulness, right? Which is the cohesion of the whole organization around what we now call strategic and moral true north. One is decisiveness at all organizational levels. And one is sort of the will to win or bias for offense, which means that you're not just passively reacting, right? You are shaping the environment. You're being proactive with the whole competitive sort of ecosystem. And it's interesting how we thought it was very important just analytically to create this kind of framework and truly distinguish agility from the rest. But now that we are implementing these ideas at very large organizations, these three things, purposefulness, decisiveness, and bias for offense rather than reactiveness, are truly coming alive. It's really amazing to see the true difference between just adaptable organizations who are really good at thinking on their feet, and they've done really well during COVID. They've galvanized the whole organization. But that was not really based on preparedness, right? It was just based on good instincts and fight and flight reflexes. And it's not guaranteed at all that the next crisis, which will be fundamentally different from COVID, right, is going to play out in exactly this way. So I can't agree more with Chuck, and it's amazing how these specific qualities are coming alive at this moment in time.
Thank you. David, what would you add, or what would you build on there?
Well, nothing, because everything I thought Chuck said, then when he said it, I thought of something else, and he said that as well. And so I've got, as Chuck said, my opening line was going to be, the word we haven't mentioned is culture. And then he mentioned that 10 times in 2 sentences, Chuck. And then I said, but we can go to strategy. And then he said strategy. And I said, the question is, we need to ask who we are. And he hit that nail as well. So that what Chuck said. I think that if we look at the Venn diagram, the 3 parts, what Leo was talking about, which is your processes and your frameworks. Chuck is your leadership and the strategy. But I want to come back to this word culture and put it as the third part of the Venn diagram. Because if you look at, to a large extent, crisis management by its very nature is the study of failure. We study the ones that go wrong because the ones that go right, we don't know about. And we tend to study the big ones because, you know, you learn more from Fukushima or from 9/11 or from Hurricane Katrina. Just the lessons are very clear. But if you look at major corporate crises, and I'm talking Boeing 737 MAX, for example, Volkswagen emissions scandals, 3 Mile Island, NASA with Challenger in Colombia, BP Deepwater Horizon. On one level, these are not dysfunctional organizations. You cannot be Boeing or you cannot be Volkswagen if you're dysfunctional, or NASA. But on the cultural level, if you read the executive summaries of the reports, they are word for word the same. A deep-rooted, decade-long culture of leadership that knowingly ignored and threats and sidelined people. That is word for word. And so I think that to sort of expand this idea of culture, the question is not what do we need to do and how are we going to do it? You've got people who can do that. The question really very much is, especially today, is what sort of organization do we believe a complex organization in stage 1, 21 to 2025, and then 2025 to 2030. What does that look like? And it's about sensitivity and the things we've spoken about, but it's about openness, it's about communication. I mean, on a technical level, as both Leo and Chuck knows, and as you know, Evan, very well, the main problem most organizations have is they cannot discuss risk rationally internally. You know, they do not have a language or a framework to actually discuss what their risk profile is in the environment they're operating, which is incredibly complex. And of course, that does two things. A, it stops seeing risk and danger and threats as something external, but much more as internal. What is our ability to engage with our stakeholders, for example? I mean, that's an internal issue. And the second thing was, it actually gives us an ability to have some leverage. We can't solve it, but we can set the direction of travel. And by setting the direction of travel, we are creating the underlying fundamental structures which allow us to become better and move towards good. And so from my perspective, we take the three things: Leo's, hard processes and frameworks, and Chuck's strategies and leadership, and then put this overarching concept of cultural. I think, what was it? The true north. You use that phrase, Leo. That's a good thing, It's a direction of travel that and it's not just words. One of the organizations that I've worked with is Emirates Airlines. And I love Emirates Airlines because every single person in Emirates, down to the person who brings you the coffee or opens the door in the morning, does it properly because we're Emirates, and you can absolutely see that I'm not somebody who's opening the door, I'm somebody who's opening the door and works for Emirates, and you can actually see that in every single one of them. It is a beautiful, beautiful thing to see, and I think adds real power to the game.
So can I start a little bit here, Leo, and I'll pass it back to you. Am I muted? No.
Nope,
Okay.
You're good.
I really like this conversation, of course, and I appreciate you taking it this way a little bit, David. Really fundamental to our book is the idea that we didn't want to write a leadership book. We wanted to write a book on agility. But it's essential to our vision of agility. We called it a special brand of leadership. And it's a special brand of leadership that owns a culture of trust and shares a culture of trust through the depth and breadth of the organization. And that's really fundamental. And the real essence of trust is people aren't afraid. They're not afraid to take risks that they're empowered to take. They're not afraid to tell truth to power. They're not afraid of each other. They feel accountable for each other. And so they're not organizations that have their feet tied together or shoelaces tied together by fear, because that it doesn't allow you to have a bias for action when it comes to dealing with uncertainty. I like the way you talked about, finding deep in the organization, some kind of leadership decay, that there may have been a great culture. In fact, there probably are great cultures, but there's usually some kind of inattention or a silo developed and a offshoot might have been created. And so we talk about commander's intent in the book as the idea of how do we cascade across the entire organization and through the depth of the organization, the same understanding of the purpose, the key tasks, and the end state that we're all going after together, so that every single person in the organization feels valued, feels they understand what they're trying to get done, and they, even if they don't know that they're pulling the risk levers the way the boss wants them to pull it, they are, just because of that shared understanding, shared trust through the organization. And frankly, so you asked the big question. I want to get back to the big question, and that's what can you do about things like that? It's really, it requires, I think, in large complex organizations, they have to have some kind of system of leader development, internal leader development. And that's what I meant by organic to the organization. You can't subcontract your leadership out to somebody, have somebody parachute in for twice a year and give a offsite. And leader behavior, the leaders throughout the organization is what develops leadership in an organization. And it really needs to be something that's done organic for a big complex organization to be successful. And then the final thing I'll say, and I will let Leo take it, is that there's usually two parts to the journey for agility. And the first part is kind of heal thyself. What's your internal requirement to create agile processes, agile leadership, agile belief systems that, a true north that's well understood, cascading commanders or leaders' intent, all those things that you have to do internally to the organization. And then it's the journey of that organization. Now it's shaped itself. Now it's going to shape the environment. Now it's in a position to shape the environment. And I don't think it's one step, two step. They can happen simultaneously, but they are two different journeys. And it takes courage for a leader to decide to embark on those journeys. Okay, go ahead.
Look, so many important aspects are being raised. One is, to your point, David, the existence of both strategic and moral true north, right? And the two are highly intertwined. And to Chuck's point, unless it's fully understood and embraced throughout the organization, and unless there is clarity throughout the organization of what this particular person does and how he contributes to that greater strategy and purpose, it's very difficult to achieve these things. The notion that unless leaders exemplify these types of behaviors consistently, all the time, in their own action, in their leadership communication, very difficult to achieve. Unless they demonstrate how to have difficult conversations, unless they demonstrate that, the pursuit of truth overwhelms sort of formal authority, right? They reward someone who is bearing bad news. Very, very difficult to achieve. But one of the interesting ways to position this within organizations, and let me preface this by saying, in the book, we spoke a lot about sort of the question, what business are we in? As a big picture strategic question about purpose and end state and so on. And of course, if you present organizations as portfolios of risks rather than portfolios of businesses, you will arrive at very different kinds of insights into that. But the same applies to everybody else. Like, you can ask this question of the leaders or anybody in the organization, what business are you in, right? And of course, the straightforward answer that many give is like, I work on the conveyor belt and I take things from here and I move them like over there, right? But deeper conversation involves, are you in the business of fighting for risk intelligence, right? You're on the front lines, right? You see things that senior leaders can't see. So are you in the business of being alert and studying the environment and being comfortable carrying that signal, whether it's true or false, to the right decision makers. So these are all the components of culture. And what we try to do is, instead of being sort of this inspirational speaking kind of genre, to make it very concrete. What are the dimensions of leadership that facilitate this environment? What are the cultural aspects like trust, accountability, empowerment, decisiveness that make this happen? So I think it's really productive to depart from sort of big picture, general inspirational conversations into very concrete ways in which organizations operate. And it's been discussed just in different fields, in social psychology and in behavioral economics, what constitutes this exploratory thinking environment where everybody is alert, they're questioning their assumptions, they're comfortable voicing dissent, right? And that creates this ability to think abstractly and connect the dots. So there are specific benefits to risk intelligence and agility that arise from these cultures.
Love that. Thank you.